Hi everyone, welcome to the 8th broadcast of State of the Arts. And we are so happy to be broadcasting from Memorial's Center of Innovation in Teaching and Learning. We've got a whole crew here to help us, and we couldn't be more grateful. So thanks to Donna Downey, Sue Cleal, Noreen Golfman and Jennifer Simpson, Janet Herron and Benjamin Dugdale for making this partnership happen. We've got like a facelift. It's because we had been shooting from a cell phone from Janet Herron's office, and now we're in this, state-of-the-art studio. This is a Facebook Live event about exploring the humanities and social sciences here at Memorial University. In this monthly program, we talk with a variety of faculty members about their work and how the issues addressed through their teaching and research are critical to the understanding of our changing world, which is changing at a velocity that we can barely keep up with. So it's really important to see this new, fresh work. My name is Lisa Moore, and I'm a writer and visual artist and an associate professor in Memorial's English department. I'm pleased to introduce our guest, Karen Solie, who is the 2018 Writer-in-Residence at Memorial University. Karen was born in Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan. She was educated at the University of Lethbridge, where she earned her BA, and at the University of Victoria, where she pursued graduate studies. Her first collection of poems, Short Haul Engine, won the Dorothy Livesey Poetry Award and was shortlisted for the Gerald Lampert Award and the Griffin Prize. Her second, Modern and Normal, was shortlisted for the Trillium Award for poetry, and her third, Pigeon, won the Pat Lowther Award, the Trillium, and the Griffin Poetry Prize. And for people who don't know, those are the biggest prizes that you could possibly win for poetry in Canada and the world, the universe and the solar system. So Karen's latest collection is The Road In Is Not the Same Road Out, published by House of Anansi. So welcome, Karen.
Thank you so much, Lisa.
I'm so glad to have you here.
I'm thrilled to be here as the first interview in the new digs.
I know, right?
It's fabulous.
So Karen, you have been away from humanity for how long?
It's hard to really tell, but the days and nights have all kind of melded together. But I have been out in Brigus at Kent Cottage since Saturday.
And you're working on a manuscript, and this is part of your role as the writer-in-residence at Memorial University.
Yes, yep. I'm finishing final edits out there, so it's a fun time.
I want to talk about this book, which is The Road In Is Not the Same Road Out, which is your last book of poetry.
Yep.
And I just want to say that this title, The Road In Is Not the Same Road Out, is, it's really, it's almost as though the knot is a fulcrum or a turning point, and we sort of have the idea that actually it is the same road, except that we're looking at it through a subjective perspective. It's about perspective.
Yeah.
Would you say that, how does that relate to the poems that are in the book?
Well, there are a lot of the poems, actually perspective is a good word, so a lot of the poems are about perspective or trying to figure out, the differences in things and events over time at a distance, whether that distance is physical, geographical, psychological, or whatever. So, yeah, and one of the title poem in the book, The Road In Is Not the Same Road Out, which is like, after a while, it was like, this is the title that nobody can remember, or it's kind of ridiculous in that respect. But the title poem in the book it came about after I had heard a interview with Rebecca Solnit, who wrote a wonderful book called A Field Guide to Getting Lost. I think I have that title right. And in it, she talks a little bit about why things look differently, why we tend to get lost when we return on the same road that we went in
Right.
on. It feels, you feel lost sometimes, which makes no sense, but it's because we don't look behind us to see what things look like when we're headed out.
When we're going forward.
Yeah, and there's weird things that happen, that when we're going somewhere familiar, the length of time it takes to get there is not the length of time it takes to get back. Things are always, seem to take a lot less time going back. And, there's of course, when we're headed somewhere unfamiliar, our concentration is different. And so all of these things are active, I hope, anyway, throughout a number of poems in the book.
So one of the things that strikes me about the poems in this book, and I just want to say a couple of things. First of all, I was slightly intimidated to read this book because I don't know why. I think, poetry can be, that it's so, there's such an intensity in the language. But when I read it, I just loved it so much, Karen. And in fact, I phoned my daughter in Montreal and said, "Oh my God, I just love this work so much. I love your voice in it." And it's completely absorbing. Anyway, what I noticed is that what we see are sometimes spaces on the side of a highway where construction is going on, and there are machinery, backhoes and things like that, which are doing reconstruction of a highway, but they're snoozing or sleeping because it's a Sunday afternoon. Okay. And it seems like we've got strip malls, and maybe they're boarded up, and cars that are in parking lots not moving. And it's really about what I would call in some of these poems non-spaces, or places that they're not tourist attractions. And they feel kind of existential to me in some way. What attracts you to those places?
In part, I've thought about this, and I don't know if I have a great answer, but it might have something to do with being from one, kind of. I grew up in rural Saskatchewan on the farm, and when I left, I realized more and more the in-between place that, not only is the part of Saskatchewan I'm from, which is the southwest, it's the quote-unquote flyover zone. It's the place I'm from is, I don't know if isolated is the right word, but it's a long way from anywhere. It's rural, but it's also very industrial because farming is an industrial practice. So, the idea of that we might have when we think of the rural is it doesn't fit with machinery and chemical and the kind of work that farming unfortunately needs to be now. But neither is it a city or a suburb or what we would necessarily think of as an industrial place. So it occupies that kind of in-betweenness, and I have always been interested in those in-between spaces, and because they're where people live. It's like when you take the train and you go along the backs of everything, and you don't see the facades. You see people's backyards, and you see, loading docks, and you see kind of the infrastructure and how and where people actually live, as opposed to the show of things.
And these poems also have this kind of amazing, beautiful alchemy of language that I would call very colloquial or down to earth. In the poem I'm going to ask you to read, there are, you quote actual road signs, and the signs are signs in the poem. There's a language that is, like you say, it's a language we use just ordinarily, but it is, we are immediately aware that this language in your poetry is doing double duty, and it's often alongside some kind of, because it's not ordinary. It's not ordinary in the context of the poem and what the poem means as a whole. So, some of these pieces, like the names on, or the words on signs, strike me as found language.
Yeah, I've always been interested in, and I've always liked to use, the language that we see around us all the time. There's, the ordinary is a funny thing, because it's, you can shove it off balance fairly easily, and it becomes extraordinary. It becomes odd, and sometimes beautiful, and sometimes menacing, of course, depending on what lens we're reading it through, the lens of our own mood. But I've always liked that, and these times that the world speaks to us in strange little ways, and I've always liked that, magnetic signs and road signs and the names of stores and things, and it's always been fascinating to me.
Yeah, and you start with this poem with the mention of a contract, and we immediately were, like, oh, this is no ordinary contract. But before you read the poem, it's also a poem about driving.
Yeah.
And I think, is driving a muse?
Yeah, it has been. Growing up where I did, where everything is a long ways apart, even, in terms of driving around to the fields, which are huge. There's a lot of driving involved. And then when I moved to Victoria to go to grad school, I would drive back to my parents' farm, 3 or 4 times a year, and there's a lot of time to think and look at things, and in my case, be on my own. And so I did a lot of thinking and a lot of looking, and that was it was where a lot of work came out of. And you also think about, there's a certain freedom about it, and which makes one think about freedom, and then that not everybody has that, not everybody can be mobile like that. And so it's everything has, oh God, at least 2 sides. I think that a lot more than that, but it's the complications that are interesting, and so I guess to a fault sometimes I tend to maybe make things more complicated than they need to be, but it's the complication of these things that interest me.
Okay, so folks, never before on State of the Arts have we had a poem read. And I'm so glad that I'm able to ask you to do this, Karen, because, we're very lucky to have Karen Solie reading us a poem.
Oh, God, thanks. Okay, well, this is called Rental Car. It's not a contract until the names are on it, though always there is one who signs off with less than a whole heart. Leading today for tomorrow, that's Mississauga's slogan. Or is it leaving? Eastbound, westbound, exodus via the 400 series highways. Personal reasons I will not get into. The 427 interchange is a long note in space, flight path of materials, the grace of which is a reason to live. Is not likewise the possibility and mortal danger of shooting its photograph from the roadbed? Is not digital radio? Accelerate into the curve by the Ford plant, its freshly birthed fusions in the nursery lot behind razor wire, their cradle the duplication of goods and services. Oakville's motto is "Go forward." And indeed, where is everyone? They are shopping in the Dixie Mall because their cars are there. They're working in pharmaceutical company offices because their cars are there. They're eating at the golf club. They're lying in their beds. Burlington is the home of Ribfest. Upon the satellite campus of the Lancaster Gentlemen's Club, sodium halos cast an abiding light whose influence fades along the paved and shouldered avenues locals call country roads. We are all locals now. A thing is what it is called. Country has become the countryside. It gets so you don't want to talk about it, though the air is thick with personal messaging. A thought could walk on it as on stones to find you. My good horse will bear me over the river of that noise. As through a burning cloud, my good horse will carry me.
Thank you.
Oh,
Thank you. I mean, Karen, I could spend about 4 hours talking about this poem with you. You know, there's that line, personal reasons I will not get into.
Yes.
And I think that's like a kind of discussion of, poetry about the poet, or that it is not, but in fact it is.
Yeah.
And there is that hint that that any contract means that someone is less willing to be in the contract than, like, I think this is very much about relationships. It's also very obviously much about place.
Yeah.
And do you think poetry is place-based? Do you think your poetry is place-based?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question because I think people relate to the place they're from or the place they're in differently. I've done a written interview a while ago that addresses this, and the same question came up, and I kind of have settled on that it's not where you are so much as how you are in a particular place. You know, one person's great place is another person's not so great place. Depending on your circumstances, depending where you are in relation to what's going on in the place, if you feel like an outsider, if you feel at the center, if, you know, all of these kinds of factors. So again, it's really about complication. And, you know, I do think that I can identify myself as being from there. I was born in Saskatchewan. I grew up there. So I'm one of those people who feels that they are from there. And I have this kind of map in my head upon which all other maps are superimposed, you know, distance and time and the horizon and what, you know, landscape looks like, what comes to mind, you know, when I think of the word tree, what immediately comes to mind, you know, and I think that's different for everyone. But since I've left that place, it really has, the complications of identifying with place have really come to the fore. And so, and it changes over time, and it changes according to what you learn about the place and all kinds of factors. So I guess that in terms of being produced through the lens of experience, all work, all art really is about place in a way, because it can't help but influence it at the time, even if it doesn't directly address it. There is some kind of influence, I would imagine. I suppose, though, but I think that it's much more complicated than
Affirm in Saskatchewan.
Yeah.
But I think this poem very much, is naming the place, by driving through a kind of non-place.
Yeah.
It's about the space between places, and those places are marked by the signs, which are hilarious. Is it about leading or leaving? And just like such beautiful. Also, your work is really funny.
Oh,
like, it's kind of hilarious. But there is this line, a thing is what it is called. And I think that is very deeply embedded in this poem, because you are naming a place that is not named, like the place between those places. So you studied philosophy.
Yeah, as a minor, as an undergrad, yeah.
But it's through your work.
Oh yeah, I still enjoy that that kind of writing, that genre of writing, and many writers, novelists, poets, nonfiction writers who refer to works of philosophy and who blur those boundaries. I find that work very interesting, and there's lots of it. So, but yeah, I guess, I mean, I don't know. I feel like I'm worrying over the same concepts just over and over again, and I don't know that will ever end.
Hope not. It's working out for you. I hope it doesn't end. There is, this almost religious tone in the penultimate stanza, with the halos of the lights and the abiding. What was abiding? The light. The light is abiding.
The light is abiding. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well,
are you making this space sacred?
A lot of, I think a lot of my poems and this one, they are about moving through a place, but they are about not knowing really the place, because again, like the signs and the designations and the mottos and whatever by the highway and the businesses and things, we see those things in passing, and so they designate the nature of the place for us, but that's not the same as knowing it, and so it kind of, I think a lot of my poems are about not knowing a place rather than knowing one. And that's interesting. One of the writers that I've come to really love and who's been a huge influence on me is Fanny Howe, and she writes a lot in her poetry, but also in her nonfiction work about her writing. She talks a lot about the principle of bewilderment and how one can proceed with bewilderment as an aesthetics and an ethics, and that's very interesting to me. That keeping aloft what one doesn't know, because it's so easy to settle into a presumption of knowing.
Mm. So, if you read your reviews, which I have read, I think everyone, people talk a lot about how you really infuse your poetry with a lot of different knowledges. So, and you were a truck driver. You were a truck driver?
I drove a half-ton. Yep, I drove my parents' half-ton from the farm from Victoria. I have a rental pickup sitting in the parking lot as we speak.
So a woman of many talents.
Well, I don't know about that. I feel like I know, in terms of the different knowledges, I might know a little about several things. I think that's kind of my speed.
So you did look at quantum physics and math. You've delved.
I've looked at them as they've gone flying over my head. Yeah.
But you're drawing on them.
Yeah.
And why?
Well, I also, you mentioned the sort of the liturgical or ecclesiastical tone of some of the language, and I was raised Catholic, and I'm old enough that I would go to Mass with my family, where my maternal grandparents lived. They also lived in an extremely rural part of Saskatchewan, and Masses were still said in Latin sometimes when I was a kid. So you know, the sound and the cadence of the language and how sometimes terrifying it was. That made a groove in my mind, I think, and so that language and that kind of music and its implications are always there. And I don't know, I see, again, this is from someone who doesn't, I'm a very much a lay person with regard to all of these things I draw on, but there's something about the gesture forward into the unknown, whatever form that gesture takes, whether it's technology or maths or religion. It's all about that gesture toward something that is unknown, and there are a lot of efforts to try and pin that down and say, well, what it is whether it's an equation or whether it's God or whether it's being able to, repopulate some other planet when we've totally trashed this one. There's a big effort to try and pin down that thing that we're reaching for, but we always run up against the fact that you can't. So all of the forms of those gestures are interesting to me.
You have said elsewhere, and I agree with you, I grew up Catholic too, and I think there is that, you are laden with that mystery, all the great mysteries.
Yeah.
And it never quite leaves you, no matter how much you may or may not
want it to.
So you've said somewhere, and I think you've said that the content decides the form, or maybe it's the other way, that the form, no, it's the content decides the form. And I'm thinking, if I were beginning to write poetry, I would want to know, how do you choose a form, and what do you mean by that? What do you mean that the content, are you talking about something as, literal as a sonnet or free verse, or are you talking about even on the level of the line?
Yeah. So much of it starts for me with a tone, with an atmosphere, and I've tried to figure out how to talk about what tone is in a poem, how to create it. I know when I read it, it's almost like the key it's played in, and the time signature. It's it's like atmosphere. It's like hearing something, and so often that doesn't stay, but it conditions how, my syntax, how I start to fool around with the syntax and the length of the line and things, and so I guess it's not a matter, people work in so many different ways, but for me it's not so much a matter of deciding on a form because I'm writing about a rental car, because I'm writing about driving or whatever it is, but they occur together, and so if I have some lines that I'm scratching down, the lines will start to feel like they want to be longer, and the duration will maybe start to emerge. The length of the thought, the duration of the thought, and that sometimes will change the content. It will change what the poem is about, and I kind of like when things end up differently than what the idea that I had for them, because then it feels like something has actually happened, and so I feel like that's a good sign. But it changes so much. I'll start off in one form, and then I'll start throwing things against the wall, and a lot changes right up until the very bitter end.
And do you work on a single poem at a time? Do you have more than one happening?
Mostly it's just I'm really slow, like incredibly slow. And the idea of working on a bunch of poems at a time and then they all get done and that'd be great, but it's never ever happened.
Yay! We still have some spontaneity.
Yes, it's never.
Is this
it's
the state
never
of the
happened. That sometimes feels like a metaphor of what working on a poem's like. But anyway, it's mostly, I'll work away at something and often do revisions at the same time. When I go back to a poem I'm working on and read what I thought was, this is like, I'll go to bed and it's like, oh man, that was really good. And then I'll get up the next morning and look at it and it's like, not good. But a way to get back into it is I'll go back to revisions and start looking at revisions and start fooling around with punctuation and the syntax and the diction and see if I can get a little life going in my revisions. And that kind of gets my brain on I was going to say along that track, but it gets me back in the state of things.
Can you, because we're almost done, I'm afraid, can you, so I'm going to hit you with a big one.
Okay.
But you have to talk really, really fast.
Okay.
No, what would you say to people who, so what I think happens is I think people come out of high school and they're writing tons of poems and they have like diaries full of them, and somewhere along the way people become afraid of poems. Or they, like it's a burst of being able to speak when you're young. How would you suggest people keep writing poems, or do you have anything that people could take as a way forward?
Well, I hope that people are getting out of high school with diaries full of lines and ideas and thoughts. That would be like, that's a great idea. That wasn't the case for me. I came to things much later. But whether you find yourself with pages and pages full of stuff, or whether you've never written a word in your life and are older and have always had this idea, there's no way to do it. There's no right way to do it. You just do it, and you read a bunch of stuff and you write stuff down. There really is no right or wrong way, and anything is possible. The sky is the limit. Anything works. Anything can potentially work. So just have at it.
Okay. Well, that's a great. So have at it. This is Karen Solie's most recent book. The road in is not the same road out. And Karen, thank you so much.
Thank you, Lisa.
You're
really
amazing. And I love this book. I love it.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone in this room.
Yes, it was great.